No, we sent in large numbers of U.S. troops in combat units. Only when we pulled our forces back and used our financial resources to buy the goodwill of people in Iraq did the Iraq war turn in the right direction. We have heard a lot about the surge, and I voted for the surge, and I tried to be as supportive as I could, realizing a defeat in Iraq would have been a horrible, demoralizing event for the people of the United States, and it would have emboldened terrorists and radical Islamicists throughout the world. I tried to be supportive, but we were obviously doing the wrong thing. We obviously used the wrong strategy. The competence of the last administration in carrying out that war and building a peace was abysmal. We could have done what we did in Afghanistan and let the Iraqis liberate themselves from Saddam Hussein's tyranny. The human and financial cost of the Iraq liberation and how it was accomplished, all of the incompetence that went with it, will be the subject of scrutiny for years to come. However, we have moved forward, and there is some signs, there is every sign of success in Iraq, and that success, it's clear that that success was brought about not necessarily by large numbers of U.S. troops, but instead, not just the surge of troops, but General Petraeus's ability to use financial resources to win the loyalty of Sunnis and other leaders, tribal leaders, in Iraq. But what is also clear is that our Iraq focus after the defeat of the Taliban prevented us from doing what was right by the Afghan people. And there is a cost to that as well. There's a cost that we will pay for not doing what was right to the Afghan people and just rushing off to commit our treasure and our troops into Iraq by stretching ourselves too thin so we couldn't do the right thing in Afghanistan. Now, what is that price that we're paying? Now, after years after the initial success of driving the Taliban out, the Taliban's radical Islamic threat is growing. And the response to this threat? Send in more U.S. combat troops. Whenever that's been tried as just a simple answer, it's failed. Whenever there's been unconventional warfare that we've had to deal with, that strategy of sending in more U.S. combat units has not worked, whether in Vietnam or Afghanistan or anywhere else. Foreign troops in a foreign land fighting as combat units will almost always end up in hostile territory, and even those locals inclined otherwise will eventually turn against foreign troops to side with their own countrymen. That dynamic is very easy to identify. President Obama is being asked by General McChrystal, who I deeply admire, to send 35,000 more U.S. combat troops into Afghanistan. If my experience tells me anything, it is that the introduction of more U.S. combat units into Afghanistan will be counterproductive and perhaps disastrous. And the likely downside to sending more U.S. combat troops is recognized by our own U.S. ambassador, General Eikenberry, who is now our U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. General Eikenberry is a career military officer with impeccable credentials and an exemplary record. He has told President Obama that more U.S. troops will mean that the Afghans will remain dependent on our military rather than stepping forward and fighting their own battle. By sending more U.S. combat troops, we will encourage exactly the wrong behavior by the Afghans. And obviously, the Afghans have proved time and again that they are willing to fight. They're willing to fight for their families, for their villages, for their way of life, and yes, they're willing to fight for Afghanistan. Well, that is so obvious, yet the easy answer for America's decision makers is simply to send more U.S. combat troops. Well, easy answers have a great deal of appeal to power brokers, but easy answers usually don't solve the problems. Yes, sending more U.S. combat troops sounds less complicated than having to deal with Afghan ethnic, tribal, and village leaders on the ground. Sending more troops sounds a lot easier and less complicated than undoing the horrendous strategic mistakes our State Department has made in forcing a foreign structure onto Afghan society since 9/11. In short, our government has tried to force the people of Afghanistan to accept centralized rule from Kabul. And even if that government wasn't corrupt, even if Karzai's brother wasn't a drug dealer, the centralized power and decision-making that we have tried to force on the Afghan people, or at least supported that being put on them, is totally contrary to the Afghan history and culture. These people are brave. They will not be subdued and pacified by a Kabul army, or especially by a foreign army, even if it's our army. No, we must make allies of the brave people of Afghanistan, not send in more U.S. combat troops to fight them. Even if our troops fight against their enemies, it is still wrong, because even if we're fighting against the Taliban, who are our enemies, it's still wrong, because it creates a dependency of the other Afghans on us to do their fighting. And in the long run, the brave, courageous people of Afghanistan will not appreciate that we have made them dependent upon us. That will not be appreciated. They are people of a tremendous integrity. I walked through Afghanistan that one week that I spent at the Battle of Jalalabad, and I remember seeing these people. If they got wounded, if they were wounded, they were gone. There was no medical evacuation there. If they stepped on a landmine, they were gone. And when they were wounded, they didn't cry out in pain. And you had young people there fighting right alongside elderly people. These people were a country, a brave and courageous country. And I remember as we walked through the countryside, people, the southern part of that country had been blown asunder by the Soviet airplanes. People were living in caves, and they would come out. They didn't know that I wasn't an Afghan. They didn't know I was an American. I had a beard and an AK-47 strapped across my shoulder. And they came and they would say, please, let us, Mujahideen, our brothers, let us give you some tea and bread. The people would come out of their caves where their families were living to give us tea and bread. And as we left, some of the Mujahideen leaders that were with me said, you know, that's all the bread they had. Their family is not going to have that bread tonight. What kind of people are these? These are wonderfully courageous people of integrity, sharing their bread because they were part of this national effort. We do not want that power and strength and integrity turned against us. We want them on our side, and we must be on their side. Sending more U.S. combat troops will not do that, accomplish that mission. U.S. Army Major Jim Gant has written a booklet entitled One Tribe at a Time. In it, he details his account of being embedded with Afghan villagers. And he lays out a strategy to defeat the Taliban from the bottom up, not from the top down. And certainly, we will defeat them not by sending in more American combat units to do the fighting, but instead, let these ferocious people do their own fighting with our support. It's a cost-effective plan, and even though it's more complex than simply sending more troops, it's the only plan that can succeed. It's focused on sending our teams, combat teams, to live with the Afghans in their villages, helping them build their militia structure, providing them guns and ammo, and yes, buying goodwill among their leaders, and perhaps helping them rebuild their country's infrastructure, perhaps a clinic in a region, perhaps helping them get a clean water supply. Afghan has the third